The following digression, I'll run through a glossary surrounding the concept of decomposition. Rather than giving a clear-cut explanation of the concept, I rather piece together a series of speculative discussions that surround the concept of decomposition, and which would cut across a unifying perspective. The way in which decomposition can be broadly considered as a set of processes in time, which in turn produce models and tools where time would act as a constraint that would tear apart any given form to then reconstitute it anew, and where we could see an intensive force of decomposition that could be put against certain theses, like the vitalist assemblages that can be found in Gilles Deleuze's ontology, as a science of ontogenesis or a science of becoming. Thus, in this presentation, we will go through a series of stages, or rather references that have been put behind the concept of decomposition. The first instance that will be considered, and where we could see the composition taking place as a creative, intensive force that would contrast with the usual knowledge that the creative force behind the intensities of becoming or ontogenesis, as mentioned in the work of Gilles Deleuze, will be also seen in the forces of decomposition. The first example that will be put into place will be a series of texts that would work around the concept of decay and putrefaction. This would be a anti-vitalist thesis that has been proposed by specifically Reza Negarestani's early texts about decay, putrefaction, and decomposition of living systems and forms. Thus, the idea of decomposition will be seen on these texts as a creative force that, even though it could be as macabre as it is, would show how a taken apart of forms can bring up into the image a new set of forms. From this trilogy of texts on decomposition, we will see the force of unbecoming that appears in decomposition, specifically on the text under the name of Undercover Softness. We would see a series of observations on what was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The idea that time would act as a constraint on living systems or organisms that, whenever they fall apart in their own organicism onto the inorganic beginnings of that living system or form, we would rather see a transformation or an alchemical, in a certain sense, an alchemical way for this form to acquire new shapes. Whenever there is an example of a unbecoming, we would see rather that the form, rather than losing itself, will show a certain essentiality or invariance or axiom that would then morphogenetically form another form. This meaning, when we observe that a corpse of a wolf can decompose, we can see how it can slowly transform into the corpse of a fox or another type of animal. So this being said, there are certain ideas that we would like to highlight from Reza Negarestani's text, specifically about the invariance or the essentialities that appear in the process of decomposition in time. I would quote from Undercover Softness the following: decay extracts infinite deformability from an interized horizon without eventuating in radical erasure or complete transformation. Such perpetual deformability is supported by the intensive and extensive complicity of horizon of interiorities in the form of an unbreakable continuity in which every horizon of interiority either inflects the next or is nested within yet another horizon. From this quote, we would see that decay deforms a living system or form. It tears it apart. It decomposes it. But rather than, as Rezanegorestani, making it an unknown form, it would rather flourish the interiorities or the invariances that appear within a given living system or form, thus giving a shape that has been inside all of this time and making it visible to us or making it explicit to us. And this interiority, this essentiality that appears would rather be the form that takes place, the form that can transform itself onto other shapes and forms. So it would be within this paradox of decomposition where we see that the shape becomes the interior shape or the essential shape of a living system of form can transform itself into other shapes and forms without moving the initial referent away. Robin McKay also comments on this project by Negorestani on his commentary on this very essay. Robin McKay comments the following. Ideas are carcasses whose differential expression comports no vital force, but rather indicates an infinite capacity for putrefaction. The articulations of the real are glimpsed only to be churned back into the process. No return to primary elements, but a generation to no end with no end. Even if we consider the idea of an essentiality coming to the fore or flourishing with decomposition, decay, and putrefaction, we would rather see that there is also not specifically a return to a grounding or an initial set of conditions, but rather a deformation of that space of interiority that would reconfigure what we would consider to be this initial living system or form. This is one of the most important ideas that can be extracted from the unbecoming of the forms or vital systems via decomposition. That meaning that we would rather try to imminently observe the transformations that take within a living system or form to make sure that this living system or form can actually transform itself onto something else in time. The intensive forces of time itself within decomposition would rather give us way to another set of forms, thus making that initial living system something that can be alien to us or that can be an alienated form to itself as well within time. Within this idea, I would like to recover the idea that within the known and through the composition, we can find the idea of the unknown. Thus, we can see a recomposition of elements within a form or living system that can derive into what is yet unknown. And this idea is something that can be sketched out briefly, for example, in Nelson Goodman's idea of making worlds. We will not use the idea of worldling or possible worlds, but rather highlights a very brief observation that Nelson Goodman works out regarding the composition and recomposition and decomposition of given forms. This meaning that we can actually see the idea that the same can become the not same within a certain determinate framework. And for this, I will quote from the essay Words, Works, and Worlds, which would be the opening essay of Ways of World Making. The idea that we can decompose and recompose. And I will quote the following. Much, but by no means, all world making consists of taking apart and putting together, often conjointly. On the one hand, dividing wholes into parts and partitioning kinds into subspecies, analyzing complexes into component features, drawing distinctions. On the other hand, of composing wholes and kinds out of parts and members and subclasses, combining features into complexes and making connections. Such composition or decomposition is normally affected or assisted or consolidated by the application of labels, names, predicates, gestures, pictures, etc. And from this, we can also go further in what I would believe would be the key part of decomposition. We do not make a new world every time we take things apart or put them together in another way, but worlds may differ, and this is highlighted in the text of Goodman, but worlds may differ in that not everything belonging to one belongs to the other. And this is a key idea on decomposition and composition, that we are not taken from a framework that would be unknown from us, but rather we take from a known framework and we would take it apart while investigating the invariances that would have a set fixed of characteristics that in the case of Goodman would be names, predicates, gestures, and pictures. We would rather see something taking place, and that something would be that which is initially unbeknownst to us, that which would be unknown, starting from the known. This meaning that we can take a cartography of transformations, a plasticity of conceptual ideas taking place while analyzing or rescuing the set of invariances within a determinate conceptual framework. And when this is applied to living systems or organisms, and even more so within the context of the human, we would rather see a taken apart of those invariances which we would believe be constitutional to that certain form, living system, or concept, and see that within the invariances, we would see a dynamo taking place, a moving of those parts into something that, once again, would be unbeknownst to us. The possibility of difference or the differing of something within a given set of constraints. Now, from this second idea, the idea that we can take a recomposition from decomposition, which is something that appears on the anti-vitalist thesis of Reza Negarestani, and which can be linked to posterior developments that have been influenced by Nelson Goodman's world-making thesis. We can go to a third instance that is also closely related to decomposition, and that has to do with complexity theory and the complexification by way of taken apart. Within complexity theory, we would rather see the thesis that to analyze an organism or a living system, we can see how it would function more closely by taking it apart in different registers or levels. We would see this taken apart or unbecoming of that living system through levels by way of a top-down approach, going from the macro state of that living system or organism onto its most fine-grained way of composition. And by analyzing the composition and taking it apart into decomposition, we would rather see a set of functions that could be compatible within themselves, within this living system or organism, or rather we would also see a set of functions within that living organism or system that could be incompatible initially within themselves. This is a thesis posed by William Wimsatt, one of the pioneers of complexity theory. And we would rather see how determinate functions within a system would make the big picture possible, in that certain sense that the coarser-grained image of that living system or organism is rather composed by a finer-grained and decomposable picturing of that living organism or system. And by taking it apart, we would rather see a depth of field that is initially not available to us within a certain framework or scientific framework. Now, the ultimate consequences of this have been briefly announced in the work of William Bechtel, a philosopher of mind and philosopher of science, who works around the concept of complexity, and where William Bechtel announces, in a certain sense, the catastrophic remains or ends of the decomposition of elements. Most precisely, whenever scientists try to decompose a living system, organism, or chemical compound within the lab, and see how within this process of decomposition we could rather see divergences take place. This meaning that if there is a certain function that can take place by decomposition, we would try to recompose it anew and see if that same function would take place. Now, what William Bechtel analyzes and sees is that rather than having that same function happening all over again, we would see divergences take place. Now, this is something that would be initially unwanted within the scientific purview of a research centered on the closed limits, where we would see a function not diverge from itself, but we could take from this catastrophic consequences a speculative proposal that would be what would happen if we see those divergences take place, and also linking with the initial purviews of the anti-vitalist theories of Reza Negarestani's early work. How can we see the unknown or the yet to be known take shape within what is already known, within the divergence of functions via decomposition, and see how this synthesis would produce something rather unknown or rather monstrous to us, but rather interesting as well. And this is also a thesis that can be closely linked to, for example, and if we situate this conversation within Althusser's Marxism and anti-humanist thesis, whilst analyzing the ideological constraints of humanism, we would rather see how, by taking it apart, by situating it within a set of complex socio, political, and economical relations, we can see humanism not disappear. And this is something that must be cleared out. Althusser never tries or intends to make humanism disappear from the field of vision, but rather complexifying it and setting a set of constraints that would rather re-signify or redefine what being human is. In the certain sense, and in the famous essay by Althusser, Marxism and Humanism, we would see that the figure of the human would be necessary. It would be a necessary shape or concept, but something that would be redefined by putting it against a set of constraints. Now, if we take this idea as well to its most catastrophic consequences, and by taking the idea that within time, we would see living systems and forms derive from an initial status or an initial shape onto something that is different. We could also apply this idea of time being a dialectical constraint that would rather alienate the idea of the human onto something that is stranger than itself, something that is more alien to itself, alienated via the constraints of time. And it would tear the idea of the human apart as a given, and going back to Althusser, as a given ideological set of ideas or concepts into something that would be rather constructive or in construction, and into something that once again would be unknown to us. So this would be the main idea behind decomposition, how by taking apart, we're actually not erasing what is currently given or known, but we would rather see another way of reimagining that living system, form, or concept into constructive ways that can be synthesized into something that is stranger to us.